The air in the hallway was a hushed, antiseptic breath, cool against my skin. Someone light, a sickly yellow, hummed from overhead panels, casting long, distorted shadows that stretched and shrank with each slow passage. I sat on a plastic chair, its surface smooth and unyielding, my fingers tracing the faint, almost imperceptible pattern on its armrest. The quiet breathing of unseen machines pulsed from behind closed doors, a rhythmic sigh that filled the void where human voices should have been. No one moved in the long corridor. No footsteps broke the sterile hush. It felt like an abandoned wing, forgotten by the world, yet still tethered to some vital, unseen force. I had been waiting for news, though the specifics now felt distant, obscured by the unnerving calm. The caller ID displayed an unfamiliar number, prefaced by a regional code I didn't recognize. "I'm a solicitor, handling the estate of a distant relative of yours, an Agnes He." Agnes He. The name was a phantom, an echo from a branch of my family tree long withered and forgotten. I vaguely remembered my grandmother mentioning a great aunt, somewhere far off, in a tone that suggested he was more myth than memory. Yes, my brow furrowing. I recall the name, faintly. Excellent. My apologies for the direct approach, but extensive searches for next of kin proved challenging. It seems you are the sole remaining beneficiary of her estate. A cottage in a rather remote locale, along with its contents. The solicitor's tone was devoid of warmth, a professional drone that conveyed information without emotion. My archivist's mind, usually so keen to categorize and order, felt a faint tremor of curiosity. What kind of life had Agnes He led, tucked away in some forgotten corner of the world? I see. And the contents? There was a pause, a subtle shift in the solicitor's breath. The most significant item, certainly the most striking, is a grandfather clock. It's quite old, highly ornate. Agnes was rather particular about it, insisted it be passed on intact if possible. A dry, rustling sound that seemed out of place in the silent hallway. A rather impressive piece, though, I confess. It never quite struck the hours in my presence. Always silent. A silent clock. The phrase hung in the air, a small, unsettling detail. But this one was different. The solicitor continued, detailing the logistics of acquiring the keys, the remote address, the necessary paperwork. I absorbed it all, nodding occasionally, the hum of the hospital machines a low, constant counterpoint to his distant voice. The thought of a remote cottage, forgotten and undisturbed, held a strange allure, a stark contrast to the sterile modernity around me. Weeks later, the gravel crunched under my tires as I navigated the winding, overgrown lane. The cottage emerged from a thicket of ancient, gnarled trees, its stone walls a tapestry of moss and climbing ivy. It was smaller than I had imagined, a hunched, solitary presence against a bruised autumn sky. The air here was damp, carrying the scent of wet earth and decaying leaves. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of dust and something else. Something metallic and faintly sweet, like old blood or forgotten flowers. Each floorboard groaned under my weight, protesting my intrusion. The cottage felt less like a home and more like a tomb, a repository of forgotten lives. And then I saw it. It stood in the main living space, dominating the room with an almost arrogant presence. The solicitor had called it ornate, but that word felt insufficient, almost dismissive. This was not mere decoration. Its facade was a riot of intertwining motifs. Serpentine vines that coiled and writhed, their leaves like grasping hands. Grotesque, elongated faces with empty eye sockets that seemed to follow my every movement. And at its apex, a stylized winged creature, its talons splayed, perpetually poised to strike. I approached it slowly, each step a deliberate intrusion. My fingers, accustomed to the smooth, cool touch of aged paper and leather, hovered inches from its surface. The carvings were unsettlingly precise, each detail rendered with a disturbing fidelity that suggested something beyond human artistry. A faint, almost imperceptible vibration seemed to thrum beneath the surface, a silent pulse that I felt more than heard. The clock was not merely an antique, it was a monolith, an artifact burdened with an inexplicable weight. It did not simply tell time, it commanded. It, the familiar world outside, with its predictable rhythms and logical progression, suddenly felt distant, a fading memory. Here, in the presence of this silent, watchful sentinel, I felt a subtle shift in the very fabric of my perception. I was not merely an heir, I was an observer, and the clock, I sensed, was observing me right back. And in its unmoving, silent gaze, I felt a terrible, ancient hunger. The solicitor's words, a dry rustle against the hushed air, faded into the low thrum of distant machinery. I stood in a dim hospital hallway, the sterile scent of antiseptic clinging to the air like a shroud. Someone panels above hummed a sickly yellow, casting long, wavering shadows that seemed to stretch and shrink with my own shallow breaths. No staff moved in the quiet expanse. Only the soft, rhythmic sighs of unseen life support machines pulsed behind closed doors. A constant, unsettling reminder of fragility. A silent clock, the solicitor, a gaunt man whose spectacles perpetually slid down his nose, had repeated, his voice barely a murmur. He'd pressed a heavy brass key into my palm moments before, its cold weight a strange counterpoint to the unexpected inheritance. My cousin, a distant relation I'd never met, had left me everything. A remote cottage in the wilds of Cumbria, and the clock. The phrase had lodged itself in my mind like a sliver of glass, sharp and insistent. What kind of clock, I wondered, refused to mark time? I traced the intricate pattern on the key with my thumb, the metal cool beneath my skin. The cottage, he explained, was miles from anywhere, a place forgotten by maps and memory. And the clock, he'd stressed, was to be treated with particular care. Its value, he'd claimed, was immeasurable, though he hadn't specified if he meant monetary or something else entirely. A prickle of unease, thin as ice, began to spread across my shoulders. It was a premonition, perhaps, or simply the exhaustion of an unexpected journey. The drive north was a blur of gray tarmac and increasingly dense green. The landscape grew wilder, hills rising like ancient shoulders against a bruised sky. Moss softened the edges of its slate roof, and a single gnarled oak stood sentinel by the front door, its branches clawing at the overcast heavens. It looked less like a home and more like a secret kept too long. Inside, the air was still and cool, thick with the scent of damp earth and forgotten wood. Dust motes danced in the sparse beams of light filtering through grimy windows. I walked through empty rooms, my footsteps echoing unnaturally loud on the bare floorboards. This would be my sanctuary, I told myself, a place to escape the clamor of the city, to find quiet. The delivery truck, rumbling up the lane an hour later, brought the clock. Two burly men wrestled it from the truck bed, grunting under its considerable weight. It was larger than I'd imagined, taller than me, a towering sentinel of polished mahogany. Its face, beneath a thick pane of glass, was an intricate dance of Roman numerals and arcane symbols I couldn't decipher, but no hands marked the hours. It was a sculpture of time, frozen. I directed them to place it in the living room, against the longest wall, where it immediately dominated the space. I stood before the clock, a sense of profound stillness radiating from its silent form. The first anomaly was a small thing. I'd unpacked a box of essentials, placing my car keys on the small, scarred mantelpiece above the fireplace. Later, needing them to fetch more supplies from the car, they were gone. I searched the mantelpiece, then the floor, the box, growing increasingly frustrated. I remembered the metallic clink as I'd set them down. Finally, after a bewildered 10 minutes, I found them. Not on the mantel, not in the box. They were nestled at the very base of the grandfather clock, tucked into a small carved recess I hadn't noticed before, a place I couldn't possibly have put them. I stared at them, then at the clock. It was an old house, I reasoned. Things shifted. I must have been more tired than I thought. That evening, as dusk bled into the rooms, painting the walls in shades of bruised violet, a faint, rhythmic thrumming began. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, a low vibration that seemed to emanate from the floorboards beneath my feet. I pressed my ear to the wood, but it ceased. When I straightened, it resumed, a soft, almost subsonic pulse that tickled the soles of my feet. I walked towards the clock, and the sensation intensified, seeming to rise from its very core. I touched its smooth, cool surface, and the thrumming stopped entirely. An old house, I told myself again, settling. Later, while making a cup of tea in the small, antiquated kitchen, the distinct sensation of being watched settled upon me. I spun around, my mug clattering softly against the counter. I walked to the living room, drawn by an invisible thread. I felt a shiver trace its way down my spine, a sensation I attributed to the cottage's pervasive damp. My mind was playing tricks, I decided, exhausted from the move, from the unexpected turn my life had taken. It was simply the adjustment to a new, isolated existence. I stood in a dim hospital hallway, the sterile scent of antiseptic clinging to the air like a shroud. Someone panels above hummed a sickly yellow, casting long, wavering shadows that seemed to stretch and recede with their own sluggish pulse. My breath, shallow and cold, misted briefly before vanishing into the stagnant air. The silence was not empty, but heavy, thick with the quiet breathing of unseen apparatus, a mechanical respiration that offered no comfort, only a profound sense of isolation. My hand, unbidden, rose to my temple, fingers pressing against a dull ache that had taken root behind my eyes. The journey back to my apartment felt like traversing a dream. The city's usual clamor muted, colors leached from storefronts and passing vehicles. Each step felt less like a conscious act and more like an instruction whispered into my ear from a great distance. I was a puppet, strung with threads of exhaustion. The apartment, when I finally reached it, offered no solace. The grandfather clock, my peculiar inheritance, stood sentinel in the corner of the living room. I watched it for a long moment, my gaze fixed on the pendulum, which swung with an almost hypnotic regularity, a slow, deliberate beat against the quietude. A minute twitch of the long, slender hands. Had they truly moved, or was it merely the tired tremor in my own vision? I blinked, rubbed my eyes. The hands were still perfectly aligned with the quarter hour. A trick of light, I told myself. Or perhaps the lingering fatigue. My mind, a frayed rope, struggled to anchor itself to certainty. I found myself pacing, a restless energy pushing me from room to room, yet never quite allowing me to settle. The air in the apartment felt different, heavier than before. A peculiar aroma began to assert itself, subtle at first, then growing more distinct. It was a smell I couldn't place, ancient and metallic, like rusted iron mixed with dust from a forgotten crypt. It clung to the upholstery, seeped from the floorboards, a pervasive note that scratched at the back of my throat. I opened windows, letting the cool evening air rush in, but the scent persisted, an invisible stain on the atmosphere. The clock's rhythmic tick-tock, usually a comforting backdrop, now seemed to possess an insidious quality, each beat a tiny, relentless hammer against the walls of my skull. In the periphery of my sight, a movement. It was tall, impossibly thin, an elongated distortion of human shape. My head snapped up, my eyes sweeping the empty space. This was not a trick of light. The exhaustion that had dogged me for days deepened into a profound lassitude. Sleep became a fractured landscape of half-waking, dreamlike states, where the clock's insistent rhythm echoed in my ears and the metallic tang filled my lungs. These were not memories, nor were they dreams I could recognize. They were fragments of something alien, something that did not belong to my world. One morning, the sun, a harsh yellow disk, streamed through my bedroom window. I lay tangled in my sheets, my body aching as if I'd spent the night wrestling with an invisible opponent. I counted them, my mind sluggish. My alarm clock, usually set for 7, showed 6:02 a.m. I had fallen asleep only a few hours ago, the hands on the bedside clock barely past 3. I pressed the button for the digital display on my bedside alarm. My internal clock, however, screamed otherwise. My body felt as though it had endured days without rest. The day progressed in a similar fog. Conversations with colleagues felt like wading through thick water, their words muffled, their faces subtly altered, their expressions almost cartoonish in their familiarity. I found myself losing track of sentences mid-thought, my own voice trailing off into mumbles. The ancient metallic scent, now an unwelcome constant, seemed to emanate from my own skin. I walked into the living room, my gaze drawn inevitably to the clock. Its pendulum swung, a tireless metronome. The hands, for a bare second, seemed to jump, not tick, but a sudden, violent lurch forward before resuming their stately progress. This was no longer a trick of the light. This was an affront to the natural order, a subtle, terrifying violation of time itself. My mind, once a clear pane of glass, was now spiderwebbed with hairline fractures, each one a testament to the growing doubt in what I saw, what I heard, what I knew. The world, my world, was beginning to crack, and I, Marcus, was standing right on the fault line. I stood in a dim hospital hallway, the sterile scent of antiseptic clinging to the air like a shroud. Someone panels above hummed a sickly yellow, casting long, wavering shadows that seemed to stretch and recede with an impossible slowness. My breathing stuttered, a shallow, ragged thing in the quiet. The question hung, a leaden weight in the space between one thought and the next. I tried to anchor myself, to recall the conversation, the reason for the solicitor's presence, a detail about a will. But the edges of the memory were frayed, dissolving into a shimmering haze. My mind felt like a film reel, the frames skipping and blurring, images refusing to coalesce. Not a memory, but an intrusion, a vastness, cold and dark, where angles bent inward upon themselves, defying any geometry I knew. I felt a pressure, not on my skin, but within, the very marrow of my bones, a sense of being stretched thin across an immeasurable expanse. I squeezed my eyes shut, pressing the heels of my hands against them. The fluorescent hum seemed to intensify, vibrating behind my eyelids. A drone that felt less like electricity and more like an ancient, indifferent song. When I opened them again, the hallway appeared subtly different. The tiles underfoot seemed to shift, their pattern subtly wrong, each square a fraction of an inch longer than it should be, creating a disorienting, endless perspective. It felt alien on my tongue, a word I was trying on for the first time. But the memory was distant, like something I'd read in a book, not something I had lived. I reached for my phone, my fingers fumbling. I needed to call someone. The faces swam, indistinct, their names like sand through my grasp. It was as if the world I knew, the people who populated it, had been erased, leaving only me adrift. A thought surfaced then, clear and concise, yet utterly foreign. The long shadow of the elder star consumes the light of lesser minds. The words were not my own. I wasn't just forgetting. I was being replaced. The idea was monstrous, a violation more intimate than any physical harm. My identity, my very essence, was being overwritten by an alien script. My stomach clenched, a sickening lurch. A wave of nausea swept over me, and I braced myself against the cool, unforgiving wall. The sterile scent of antiseptic suddenly tasted metallic, like old blood on my tongue. I looked down at them, watching the slight tremble, feeling a profound disconnection. Were these even my hands? I tried to force a memory, anything solid. A birthday party, the taste of cake. A specific conversation with the solicitor about the clock. The details, vivid only moments ago, now crumbled into dust. Instead, another image pressed forward. Vast, obsidian structures piercing a sky choked with alien constellations. Structures that pulsed with a slow, rhythmic energy, humming with that same indifferent song. This was not a nightmare. This was a waking theft. I was becoming a vessel, a repository for a history that was not human, that was not mine. I was losing myself, and the universe, in its incomprehensible vastness, simply did not care. The low thrum of distant machinery continued, a quiet, ceaseless breath in the deserted hallway, bearing witness to my silent internal dissolution. I had to leave this place. I had to go back to the clock. Not to escape it, but to confront it, to try and reclaim the fragments of myself before I became nothing more than an echo in its timeless, hungry mechanism. But even as I turned, the thought of home felt strangely remote, a concept that no longer held the warmth of familiarity. The sterile tang of antiseptic stung my nostrils, a phantom scent in a hallway that stretched into an unnerving infinity. Someone's lights, muted and jaundiced, cast long, distorted shadows of unseen apparatus. The air itself hummed, a low, rhythmic sigh like a gargantuan lung, the quiet breathing of machines tucked behind closed doors. No footsteps echoed but my own, each one swallowed by the linoleum floor, leaving me adrift in a silent, desolate corridor. I wasn't sure how I had come to be there, or where I was going. My mind, a fractured mirror, offered no coherent explanation, only the persistent gnawing awareness of an absence within me, a hollow where my own history once resided. The lack of any other presence amplified my isolation, cementing the terrifying truth. I was utterly alone in this unraveling. The memory of the clock, its slow, inexorable tick-tock, pulled me back from the liminal space. I needed answers, a tether to the reality that was slipping through my fingers like fine sand. Back in the apartment, the grandfather clock stood sentinel, its polished mahogany gleaming with a sinister sheen. Its brass pendulum swung with a hypnotizing rhythm, a metronome counting down to my own dissolution. My hands, trembling, reached for the laptop, the screen a stark artificial light in the dim room. My vision blurred, not from tears, but from the sheer frustration of knowing something unspeakable lurked within my home, yet finding no lexicon to describe it. The clock was an heirloom, passed down through generations. An obscure branch my father had once vaguely mentioned, distant relatives whose names had faded into the annals of time. This was a thread, however slender. I began to comb through online genealogical databases, sifting through census records and dusty obituaries. My family tree, once a simple line, branched into a gnarled, forgotten thicket. Names, dates, locations, they blurred into an indistinguishable mass until a pattern, faint at first, began to coalesce. Several entries separated by decades, then centuries, bore striking similarities. A great-great-aunt, described in an old newspaper clipping as having succumbed to a sudden, inexplicable madness. A distant cousin, noted in a parish register as having vanished without a trace. The library became my sanctuary, or perhaps my tomb. The air hung heavy with the scent of aged paper and dust motes dancing in the shafts of weak sunlight filtering through high windows. I buried myself in forgotten tomes, obscure historical texts, and the musty, brittle pages of local chronicles. My search became more focused, a relentless hunt for any mention of my ancestral surname, coupled with words like peculiar, strange, or unnatural. Then, a breakthrough. Tucked away in a privately published family history, a slim volume bound in faded green leather. I found it. A casual mention, almost an aside, regarding a family curse tied to an unusual inheritance. The author, a distant relative from the late 19th century, wrote of the timepiece, an object passed down, generation to generation, always to the eldest male. He spoke of its peculiar influence, how it seemed to gather time unto itself, and of family members who, after its acquisition, began to speak in voices not their own, or recall events that never transpired. My breathing stuttered. The author, himself a victim, ended his account abruptly. The final pages filled with increasingly erratic handwriting, culminating in a scrawled warning about the hungry mechanism and the vast, indifferent eye. I traced the lineage backward, matching names to the unsettling anecdotes. The disappearances, the madness, the sudden deaths, they all coincided with the passing of the timepiece to a new custodian. My ancestors weren't just unlucky. They were links in a chain, each one a sacrifice, a meal for this ancient parasitic hunger. The clock wasn't merely an object. It was a conduit, an anchor for something that transcended human comprehension, something that fed on the very fabric of consciousness. The words on the page seemed to ripple, the ink bleeding into impossible patterns, briefly taking on a non-Euclidean geometry before snapping back into place. Or was the clock's influence already reaching beyond the confines of my apartment, distorting the very reality around me? The realization was a crushing weight. I was not merely losing my mind, I was being consumed, my identity slowly replaced by the insidious history of an entity that had done this countless times before. My fight was not just for my memories, but for the very existence of Marcus. And the clock, back in my silent apartment, continued its measured, relentless beat, counting down to my final, utter erasure. The air, thin and sterile, scraped a raw path down my throat. My eyes fluttered open to a landscape of muted blues and greens, a palette of clinical indifference. I lay on something firm and cool, the fabric beneath my cheek rough, smelling faintly of disinfectant and old institutional starch. Above me, a fluorescent panel flickered with a tired hum, casting a sickly, uneven glow across a stretch of empty hallway. The question spun in my mind, a loose cog in a rusty machine. My head throbbed with a dull, persistent ache, a pressure behind my eyes that felt like a fist clenching. I pushed myself up, my limbs heavy, uncooperative. The floor, a mosaic of chipped linoleum, stretched into a vanishing point, swallowed by shadow. The only sounds were the distant, rhythmic sigh of unseen machines, a quiet breathing, steady and unconcerned, and the faint, almost imperceptible drip. Somewhere far away. This was a hospital, I realized, or some forgotten wing of one. How had I arrived here? A memory stirred, a fragile thing, like dust motes dancing in a sunbeam. I had been at home, poring over the family tree, tracing the grim lineage of my ancestors, the whispered tragedies that followed the passing of the clock. A name, a face, flickered at the edge of my consciousness. The colleague. He had visited, I was certain. A concerned expression, a hand on my shoulder, his voice a low murmur of worry. We had talked, hadn't we? I tried to grasp the details, to anchor the memory, but it slipped like wet soap. I focused, closing my eyes, willing the image to coalesce. His face, his earnest eyes. It was as if a page had been torn from my personal history, cleanly, brutally. This was not simply forgetfulness. I moved down the corridor, one hand trailing along the wall, the painted plaster peeling under my touch. Each step was a question mark, each breath a struggle against a growing panic. The wall itself seemed to buckle, the straight lines of the hallway bending inward, creating an impossible angle, a corner that should not exist. My mind recoiled, rejecting the visual information, yet my eyes were fixed, unable to look away. Within that warped space, a faint luminescence pulsed, a sickly green light, like phosphorescence deep beneath the ocean. It was a familiar light, a light I had seen emanating from the clock's polished wood, from the brass face, from the very air around it in my study. But this was not the clock. The distortion deepened, twisting the very fabric of the hallway. The green light intensified, and within its glow, I saw it. Not a solid form, not a creature of flesh and blood, but a vast, shimmering outline, a colossal, non-Euclidean geometry of pure energy. It was immense, stretching beyond the confines of the corridor, beyond my comprehension, its edges indistinct, phasing in and out of existence like a ripple in water. It was an entity of impossible scale, ancient beyond human reckoning, indifferent to my fragile existence. They were not merely trapped. They were part of it, their consciousnesses absorbed, their identities fuel. The faint outlines of their memories, their lives, flickered within the vast green glow, like motes of dust caught in a monstrous hungry eye. It was not a failing of my own mind. This was an external force, a parasite of thought, an entity that fed on the very essence of consciousness, slowly consuming, replacing, erasing. The clock was not a source of madness. It was merely an anchor, a conduit through which this cosmic horror siphoned the minds of my lineage, one by one. My own memories, the conversation with the colleague, the details of my life, they were not forgotten. They were eaten. I was a meal, slowly being consumed, my identity dissolving into the indifferent maw of something utterly alien. I was not losing my mind. I was losing myself. And the process was already well underway. The hospital hallway, the sterile air, the quiet breathing of machines. It was all a fragile illusion, a thin veneer over an incomprehensible, consuming truth. Above me, the ceiling tiles stretched in an endless grid, each square a testament to mundane order, yet somehow unsettling. My head throbbed with a dull, persistent ache, a quiet percussion behind my temples. I pushed myself upright, the movement stiff, my muscles protesting. A weak tremor ran through my limbs. I was in a hospital bed, but the room was not a room. It was a narrow alcove off a long, dim hallway. Someone tubes, half dead, cast a sickly yellow glow that fought with the gray light filtering from distant windows. A low hum filled the space, the quiet breathing of unseen machines somewhere around a bend. No voices, no footsteps, only the mechanical exhalation and the echoing silence. The silence felt vast, ancient, as if this corridor had existed before sound itself. My hand went to my pocket, a desperate, familiar gesture. My phone was there, miraculously. The cool glass felt like an anchor in a rising tide of disorientation. I needed to call someone, anyone. My fingers, clumsy and slow, found the contact for a colleague, a man named Robert, whose voice had always been a solid, reassuring presence. It was thin, stretched, laced with an unfamiliar edge. "Where are you?" "Difficult to reach." My throat constricted. "Difficult? What happened?" A pause, pregnant with accusation. "You don't remember? You just vanished from the office." I hadn't been to the office in days, had I? "It's been happening, Robert, the changes. I can't do this right now." The line went dead, the chirping bird replaced by a flat, empty tone. Isolation, stark and absolute, settled over me like a shroud. The entity was not merely altering my mind. It was severing my connections, making me a pariah in my own life. I swung my legs over the side of the bed. the rough fabric of the gown abrasive against my skin. Each door along its length was closed, uniform and unyielding. The air grew heavier with each step, thick with the scent of old paper and dust, an underlying metallic tang that made my teeth ache. As I shuffled along, my reflection caught in a polished metal plate on a cart left abandoned against a wall. My face was drawn, eyes wide and haunted. But it was my face. A flicker of recognition, a small victory, a silent scream caught in my throat. I tore my gaze away, my breath catching in ragged gasps. The corridor seemed to curve in ways that felt wrong, the angles shifting subtly, defying the clean lines of architecture. A side passage, previously unnoticed, now appeared, beckoning with an even deeper gloom. Driven by a primal urge to escape this place, I turned down it. On the floor, near a discarded stretcher, a small white band caught my eye. I picked it up, my fingers trembling. My name, Marcus, was printed clearly on it. Below, a date, 3 weeks ago, and a ward number, followed by a diagnosis I couldn't quite decipher. A string of letters and numbers that blurred into meaninglessness. I remembered the initial curiosity about the clock, the subtle shifts in perception, the growing unease. But I remembered being at home, in my apartment, not here, not in this spectral hospital. This was a violation, not of body, but of time itself. The entity wasn't just planting new memories. It was erasing and rewriting my own timeline, inserting entire lost periods of my life. Had I been here before? Had the clock, or something connected to it, brought me here, only for my memory of it to be wiped clean? My identity, once a sturdy edifice of experiences and recollections, now felt like a crumbling ruin. The edges of myself were fraying, dissolving into the ancient hum that permeated this place. The walls of the hallway seemed to press in, the light dimming further, and I understood, with a terrifying clarity, that I was not alone here. The entity was watching, playing, and I was merely a puppet on its incomprehensible stage, my strings slowly being cut, one by one. Above me, the ceiling tiles stretched into a dim infinity, each square a testament to a forgotten architect's vision of bland order. I pushed myself up, a dull ache blooming behind my eyes. The hallway was empty, a long, silent corridor bathed in the anemic glow of overhead fluorescence that hummed a low, unsettling lullaby. The doors lining the walls were all identical, anonymous portals to unknown miseries. No staff, no hurried footsteps, just the quiet, rhythmic sigh of unseen machines breathing behind closed doors. My own breathing stuttered, a shallow, ragged thing in the profound stillness. A memory flickered, a fragment of cold iron and the grinding of gears. It had been there, looming, its brass face a distorted mirror. My head throbbed, not just with pain, but with the pressure of too many thoughts trying to coalesce, like ice shards reforming into a sinister sculpture. My fingers, surprisingly steady, probed the rough fabric of the gown I wore, a flimsy testament to a fleeting moment of institutional care. But who had brought me here? How long had I been lost to myself? The silence of the hallway pressed in, amplifying the frantic beat of my heart. My gaze fell upon a forgotten cart near a fire extinguisher, its metal glinting dully. On its lowest shelf, amidst discarded bandages and empty saline bags, lay a crumpled sheaf of papers, my own frantic research notes. Someone, in their sterile tidiness, had clearly missed them. A desperate surge of resolve pushed me forward. This was not a reprieve. It was merely a different cage. I snatched the papers, my hands trembling as I smoothed them against the cool metal of the cart. The familiar scrawl of my own hand, the hurried diagrams, the cryptic annotations from ancient texts I'd unearthed in forgotten libraries. My eyes scanned the words, no longer just symbols on a page, but keys turning in a lock I hadn't known existed. The names, the dates, the recurring pattern of disappearances and mental breakdowns among my distant kin. It was something far more precise, far more monstrous. I saw it not as an object, but as a wound in the fabric of existence. Its angles, which once seemed merely peculiar, now shifted in my mind's eye, refusing Euclidean logic. They stretched, bent, and converged upon themselves in impossible ways, like the folds of a starved predatory flower. It was not built. It was manifested. It wasn't a ghost, not a demon. Those were human concepts, bound by human understanding. This was older, vast beyond reckoning, a hunger that predated light. It existed not in time, but around it, a timeless parasite. It clung to the clock, not for sustenance, but as a fisherman clings to his net, patient and indifferent. The consciousness it devoured, my ancestors' minds, my own, were merely the bait. A wave of nausea washed over me, a sickening lurch as if the floor itself had tilted. I saw them then, a procession of faces, fleeting and indistinct, yet achingly familiar. A man with a powdered wig, his gaze vacant, his posture stiffly unnatural. Their memories, their emotions, their very selves were gone. What remained were husks, animated by a sliver of the parasite's own alien awareness, mimicking life until the physical vessel failed. The realization struck me with the force of a physical blow, stealing the air from my lungs. Piece by piece, thought by thought, memory by memory, it was weaving its own incomprehensible history into the tapestry of my mind, until only its narrative remained. My identity, my very essence, was being meticulously unraveled, like a thread pulled from an ancient garment. The hallway, with its muted colors and sterile scent, suddenly felt like the antechamber to an endless silent tomb. My breathing faltered, a dry gasp. The hum of the machine seemed to intensify, a low, resonant thrumming that vibrated not in my ears, but deep within my very bones. And the understanding was a blade, turning slowly in my mind. Above me, the ceiling tiles stretched into a dim infinity, each square a testament to a bland, forgettable order. The soft thrum of distant machines provided the only pulse in the hushed hallway, a rhythm of quiet, mechanical breathing. The stretch of linoleum, polished to a dull sheen, reflected the wan glow of emergency lights. Each door along the corridor was closed, anonymous, suggesting worlds of suffering or recovery, yet utterly silent. My body felt like a foreign vessel, heavy and disconnected, a dull ache blooming in the hollows behind my eyes. It wasn't the kind of pain that announced a wound, but rather a deep, systemic exhaustion, as if my very consciousness had been wrung dry. Not in words, not in a coherent language, but in a persistent, formless pressure against the walls of my skull. It felt like a tide of static, a shimmering haze that sought to blur the edges of my own thoughts, replacing them with a vast, indifferent emptiness. Memories flickered, fragmented and unreliable. The last clear image was the clock, its brass gleaming with an unnatural light, its pendulum a hypnotic, relentless swing. Then a collapse, a falling into a void that smelled of old wood and something far older, something alien and cold. I pushed myself up, my muscles protesting with a tremor that ran from my shoulders to my fingertips. The rough sheet snagged on my skin. The world tilted, the hallway seeming to stretch and contract with each beat of my faltering heart. The muted greens of the walls shifted to a deeper, bruised indigo, then back again, as if the light itself struggled to decide what it wanted to be. They were it, the light? Or was it my eyes? Or was it the parasite still distorting the very fabric of my seeing? A profound weariness threatened to pull me back down, to surrender to the comforting oblivion that the entity offered. It promised peace, an end to the struggle, emerging into its vast, timeless existence. A single, sharp image, cutting through the haze. The clock's face, not with its usual numbers, but with a swirling, impossible geometry. Shapes that defied Euclidean logic, angles that shouldn't exist. And within that maelstrom, a point of fragility. It was a shard of pure, defiant thought, my own. The clock was not merely a gateway, it was an anchor. The entity, ancient and immense, could not manifest fully in this reality without a tether, a focal point. It used the clock, this heirloom, this innocuous object, to seep into the world, to reach for minds like mine. And if it could be anchored, it could be unmoored. The silence wasn't empty. It was a hungry quiet, waiting. My gaze swept the hallway again, searching for something, anything. The entity had fed on my memories, my identity, but it hadn't consumed everything. There was a core, a stubborn ember of Marcus that still burned, a desperate will to reclaim what was lost. The plan formed, not as a sudden revelation, but as a mosaic pieced together from fractured insights. The clock thrived on continuity, on the steady march of time it represented, the subtle, insidious consumption it enacted. Its power grew with each passing moment, each consciousness it absorbed. But what if that continuity was violently broken? What if its anchor was shattered, not merely stopped? I needed to return to the apartment, not a weapon of metal or fire, but of disruption. The entity was ancient, yes, but it operated on a principle of slow, methodical absorption. A sudden, chaotic obliteration might be its undoing. I swallowed, my throat dry and aching. The cost would be immense. To destroy the clock meant to sever the entity's connection, but also to risk severing my own. My mind had become so entwined with its influence, so scarred by its presence, that tearing it away might rip me apart completely. But there was another, far more terrifying possibility. To become a fractured echo, a permanent ghost in the clock's shattered remains, forever aware, forever broken, forever feeding the entity in a new, monstrous way. Or worse, to become a vessel, an empty shell, its true occupant now fully in control, walking in my skin. My hands clenched into fists, the rough fabric of the blanket digging into my palms. To fade, piece by piece, until Marcus was merely a whisper in a monstrous, timeless mechanism. My eyes, though still clouded by fatigue and fear, now held a glint of fierce purpose. I would find a way. The clock had taken so much, but it would not take my last choice. The hallway, for a brief, terrifying moment, seemed to stretch into an infinite tunnel before snapping back, its clinical indifference a fragile veneer over something far more sinister. Above, fluorescent tubes hummed with a sickly, attenuated glow, washing the long hallway in a perpetual twilight. The soft, rhythmic exhalations of unseen machines pulsed from behind closed doors. A constant, mechanical breathing that was both utterly devoid of life and terribly persistent. I was not in a hospital. I knew this with a certainty that settled in my bones, cold and sharp as a shard of ice. This was a construct, a fabrication spun from the threadbare remnants of my own consciousness. It was a cage, exquisitely designed to lull me into a stupor, to let the entity continue its slow, deliberate consumption. But I had a plan. A desperate, fragile thing, forged in the liminal spaces between waking and the encroaching dream. I would sever the connection. My fingers, stiff and clumsy, curled into fists against the rough sheet. A tremor ran through me, not of cold, but of a resolve so brittle it might shatter. I pushed myself up, the movement of vast effort, my limbs heavy, disconnected. The hallway stretched before me, a tunnel of pale, peeling paint, receding into an impossible distance. This was the entity's indifference made manifest. A prison designed without a thought for escape. A ripple on a vast ocean. The voice was my own, yet not. It was the echo of myself, filtered through countless other echoes. It sought to erode my very foundation. I forced myself to stand, my legs wobbling. The floor, a dull linoleum, seemed to undulate slightly under my bare feet. A trick of the light, I told myself, or a trick of the mind. The hallway walls, initially straight, now seemed to lean inward, then outward, subtly shifting their angles, hinting at geometries that defied earthly logic. I saw my childhood room, sun-drenched and warm, but the toy train on the track was rusted, the paint peeling from its cheerful engine. It was my past, yes, but tainted, like old film stock left to rot. A wave of nausea washed over me. This was the core of its assault. Not just taking my memories, but defiling them, making them repugnant. It wanted me to reject my own history, to willingly surrender the scaffolding of my identity. I staggered forward, one foot in front of the other, the rhythm of my steps a defiant counterpoint to the silent breathing of the machines. The doors along the hallway began to change, their surfaces rippling like disturbed water. Another dissolved into a swirling vortex of deep, bruised purples and greens like oil on water. "You are an echo," the entity hissed, its voice now layered, a chorus of forgotten voices, each one subtly twisting my name. A memory of a memory. You belong to me. I pressed my hands against my temples, the pressure a desperate attempt to anchor myself. These were the others, the ones consumed, their consciousnesses merely fuel. My deepest fear, the one that had gnawed at me since the clock first began its insidious work, materialized before me. I saw myself, not as Marcus, but as a blank canvas, my features indistinct, my eyes empty. I was merely a vessel, a conduit for the ancient hunger. This was true oblivion, not death, but the erasure of self, the ultimate insignificance. "I am not an echo," I choked out, a defiant tremor in my voice. "I am Marcus, I remember." I focused on one memory, a simple one. The texture of my grandfather's hand, gnarled and warm, as he taught me to tie a fishing knot. The scent of pine and damp earth. A small, perfect moment of connection. The entity recoiled, a shriek of static ripping through the impossible space. The shifting walls solidified, though still warped, angled wrongly. The faces in the paint receded, replaced by the faint, discolored streaks of damp. It was a momentary victory, a chink in its armor. My individual memory, my unique experience, was a weapon. I pushed forward, the pain in my head a white-hot spike. The effort of holding on to my identity, of forcing back the tide of its influence, was immense, like trying to hold a crumbling dam with my bare hands. The air grew thick, metallic, tasting of rust and old blood. I had to sever the connection entirely, even if it meant tearing a part of myself away. It was always the clock. Its presence was everywhere, though I saw no physical form. It was the rhythm of the machines, the impossible geometry of the hallway, the very air I breathed. To sever the connection, I had to find its anchor, its heart, and destroy it. Not physically, but within this realm of consciousness. I closed my eyes, the impossible visuals too much to bear. I plunged inward, into the maelstrom of my own mind, searching for the core of the entity's presence. I felt its tendrils, fine as spider silk, wrapped around my memories, my emotions, my very sense of self. To cut them, I would have to cut a piece of myself. A memory surfaced, unbidden, yet strangely potent. The glint of sunlight on the clock's brass pendulum, the rhythmic swing, the hypnotic tick-tock. It wasn't just a clock, it was a heart, pumping its insidious influence through my veins. I had to stop the pendulum. I had to stop the time. With a scream that tore from my throat, a sound that seemed to shatter the false quiet of the hallway, I lunged. Not physically, but spiritually, mentally. I focused on the image of the pendulum, its relentless swing. The pain was unbearable, a tearing, wrenching agony that threatened to rip my consciousness apart. It was as if my brain was being flayed, cell by cell, memory by memory. And then, with a final desperate surge of will, I twisted. A sound, not of this world, ripped through the air. A vast, shuddering groan, like ancient stone grinding against stone. The hum of the machines faltered, sputtered, and died. The impossible angles of the hallway snapped back into something resembling straight lines, though they still felt wrong, subtly off-kilter. The overwhelming presence of the entity, a suffocating weight, receded. I lay there, gasping, the taste of ash in my mouth. The hospital hallway was still there, dim and silent, but something had shifted. The air felt lighter, thinner, yet also empty. Or at least, its direct, suffocating hold on me was broken. I had paid a terrible price. I was Marcus, yes, but a diminished Marcus, a self carved down to its bones. A cold, slick surface pressed against my cheek, and a low, rhythmic hum vibrated through the floorboards beneath me. My eyelids felt weighted with lead, grudgingly parting to reveal a world muted and stretched, as if viewed through a film of viscous oil. I lay on the floor of a dim hallway, the air thick with the clean, sharp scent of antiseptic, a smell that did little to cut through the fog in my skull. Someone lights, sickly yellow, pulsed overhead, casting long, wavering shadows that danced with the quiet, mechanical breathing of unseen machines. There were no footsteps, no hushed voices, no bustling movement. Only the machines, murmuring secrets to themselves in the sterile quiet. My head throbbed, a dull, persistent ache that resonated deep behind my eyes. I pushed myself up, my limbs protesting with a surprising weakness. The hallway stretched before me, a tunnel of pale linoleum and institutional off-white walls. But as my gaze drifted, the lines began to waver. A corner seemed to sharpen into an impossible angle, then soften, then sharpen again. The floor, for a flickering instant, appeared to curve upwards towards the ceiling, mocking the very laws of perspective. I blinked, hard, and the distortions receded, leaving only the mundane, yet somehow wrong, corridor. A tremor ran through me, not of fear, but of a profound, unsettling recognition. Yet, as I pushed myself to my feet, the victory tasted like ash. My memories, once a clear, flowing stream, now felt like shattered glass, pieced together by a clumsy hand. Fragments of my life, a childhood laugh, the scent of a particular flower, the warmth of a friend's hand, surfaced, only to be immediately overshadowed by images that were not my own. These were the echoes, the lingering psychic residue of the entity, interwoven with the very threads of my being. My hand went to my temple, pressing against the skin as if to hold my mind together. But I was also a library of forbidden texts, a repository of a consciousness so vast and old that it threatened to drown my own. The entity was banished from the clock, but its tendrils had taken root within me. I started to walk, each step an effort, my body feeling less like my own and more like a vessel navigating an unfamiliar landscape. The hallway stretched on, interminable. My reflection caught my eye in a polished surface, perhaps a fire extinguisher casing. My face was gaunt, eyes wide and haunted, but it was my face. I shook my head, the image dissolving. It was a constant companion now. The low thrum of the machines intensified, or perhaps it was just my heightened awareness, tuning into the subtle vibrations of the world. It sounded less like a machine, and more like a vast, slow breath, a rhythmic pulse that mirrored the impossible, ancient rhythms now imprinted upon my own consciousness. I listened, my mind sifting through the layers of sound, trying to discern if the hum was external, or if it was the entity's lingering presence, a low-frequency vibration within my very bones. I ran a hand over the cool, smooth wall, the texture concrete and real beneath my fingertips. Yet my mind insisted on seeing the faint, swirling patterns of a forgotten glyph. The entity had not just fed on my consciousness, it had rearranged. It, leaving a permanent imprint. The world, once familiar, was now a subtly distorted mirror, reflecting back fragments of its vast, uncaring history. The hallway ended in a pair of automatic doors, their frosted glass offering no hint of what lay beyond. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the push plate. A world that would no longer make sense? A life where every memory was suspect, every perception a potential lie? The entity was gone, yes, but it had left me with a terrifying understanding of the universe, a glimpse into depths that no human mind was ever meant to comprehend. The knowledge was a poison, slowly seeping into every corner of my being. I pushed the door open, the faint hiss of the mechanism echoing in the vast empty space of my mind. The world beyond was brighter, but no less alien.